The news of Ace Frehley's death hit the rock world like a thunderclap. For millions of fans, it marked the end of an era, the final note of a sound that defined generations. But for Gene Simmons, the shock carried a heavier, more personal weight. Behind the public statements and the carefully worded condolences, there lay decades of unresolved anger, disappointment, and a bond that had fractured long before Ace took his final bow. In the days following Frehley's passing, Gene Simmons' words were cold, cutting, and unfiltered. "I will never forgive him. We created the monster bond together." Those words became the headline that reignited conversations about one of the most complex and turbulent relationships in rock history. Beneath the makeup, the pyrotechnics, and the fame of Kiss was a relationship that had started with youthful dreams and ended with bitter silence. When Gene Simmons first met Ace Frehley, the guitarist was just another kid from New York with a beat-up guitar and an impossible dream. In those early days, the band wasn't the global machine it later became. It was four young men trying to carve a place in a music scene that didn't quite know what to make of them. Simmons recalls that moment vividly. Ace had a spark, not just talent, but a raw, rebellious energy that fit perfectly into the vision Kiss was trying to create. "When I first met Ace," Gene once said, "he was just a kid from New York with an old guitar. Back then, we all thought we could conquer the world." And for a while, it worked. The combination of Gene's discipline, Paul Stanley's songwriting precision, Peter Criss's rhythm, and Ace's unpredictable brilliance gave birth to something new, something larger than life. The black and white makeup, the explosions, the fire breathing, the costumes, all of it became part of a mythos that millions bought into. But that myth came with a cost. As the fame grew, so did the pressure. Gene was the businessman, the one who treated Kiss like a brand before bands even knew what branding meant. Ace, on the other hand, was the artist, chaotic, intuitive, and uninterested in profit margins. The two men could not have been more different. "Conquering the world takes money and business sense," Gene would later say. But Ace never understood that. He only cared about music. He thought I was greedy, that I turned everything into a business deal. But without business, Kiss would never have survived. That difference in worldview planted the first seeds of resentment. Through the 1970s, Kiss became one of the biggest bands on the planet. Stadiums filled with fans wearing their makeup, chanting their names, and living for the spectacle. But behind the scenes, the tension was growing. Ace's struggle with alcohol was no secret. The late-night parties, the missed rehearsals, and the unpredictable behavior began to wear down the band's patience, especially Gene's. "We fought countless times over his attitude and his drinking in the early days," Simmons admitted. Gene saw Kiss as a disciplined empire that had to be protected at all costs. Ace saw it as a creative brotherhood that had lost its soul. Every argument seemed to end the same way, with Gene demanding responsibility and Ace walking out in defiance. Eventually, the inevitable happened. When Frehley left the band, the official reason given was creative differences. But in a rare moment of honesty, Gene later confessed, "When he finally left, I told everyone it was because of creative differences, but deep down, I knew I was the one who pushed him out." Those words, stripped of their corporate gloss, revealed something deeper: guilt. Gene had built a fortress around Kiss, but in doing so, he had driven out one of its founding spirits. After years of separate careers, lawsuits, and interviews laced with bitterness, Kiss shocked the world in 1996 by announcing a reunion tour with the original lineup. Fans were ecstatic. For the first time in decades, Gene, Paul, Ace, and Peter would share the same stage, in full makeup, like it was 1975 again. When Ace stepped on stage that night, holding his signature silver Les Paul, the crowd went wild. For a moment it felt like time had reversed. The cheers drowned out years of anger and division. But behind those stage smiles and pyrotechnic flashes, the old wounds were still there. "He came back with that silver Les Paul and the crowd went wild," Gene said. "But only we knew how fake those smiles were." The reunion wasn't built on forgiveness. It was built on nostalgia and money. The band members tolerated one another long enough to complete the tour, but beneath the surface, the same old tensions were simmering. Ace was still the free spirit. Gene was still the enforcer. And every night beneath the makeup, the resentment grew a little sharper. By the time Kiss announced their 2001 farewell tour, the cracks were impossible to ignore. The idea was to give fans one last glimpse of the original magic before the band called it quits. But internally, it was anything but a celebration. Ace wanted something more. He wanted to play his own songs, the ones that reflected his identity beyond the Kiss machine. But Gene saw it differently. He wanted to play more of his own songs, Gene recalled. And I said no. I yelled at him. The audience came to see Kiss, not Ace Frehley. That confrontation would become their last major fight, the one that sealed the fate of their friendship. Ace eventually left again, this time for good. He pursued solo projects, spoke openly about his frustrations, and distanced himself from the business empire Gene had built. For Gene, the departure was both a relief and a wound. He had kept Kiss alive, but he had lost a brother. In the years that followed, both men went on their separate paths. Gene continued expanding Kiss into a global brand: merchandise, comic books, cruises, and even coffins. Ace toured on his own terms, reconnecting with fans who loved his raw authenticity and unique style. But the animosity never truly faded. Whenever interviews brought up Frehley, Gene's words were sharp and often defensive. To him, Ace was the embodiment of wasted potential, a man who could have ruled the world but chose chaos instead. To Ace's fans, however, he was the soul of Kiss, the heart behind the mask, the guitarist who reminded everyone that music wasn't supposed to be perfect, it was supposed to be real. When news broke of Frehley's passing, Gene's statement, "I will never forgive him," struck a nerve. It wasn't just a refusal of reconciliation. It was an admission that the hurt had never healed. The bond they once shared, the monster they created together, had consumed them both. Looking back, the tragedy of Gene Simmons and Ace Frehley lies in their opposites. Gene was structure, discipline, and ambition. Ace was spontaneity, freedom, and rebellion. Together they made magic. Apart, they made history. Their partnership gave Kiss its dual nature, the businessman's empire and the artist's fire. Without Gene, there might never have been a Kiss brand that endured for 5 decades. Without Ace, there might never have been a reason for fans to fall in love with it in the first place. But ego, addiction, and pride stood in the way of understanding. For Gene, Ace represented everything he couldn't control. And for Ace, Gene symbolized everything he hated about fame. The bitterness became a wall that neither man could climb over, even when time began to run out. Today, as fans mourn Ace Frehley, the spotlight inevitably turns to Gene Simmons, the man who shared the stage, the studio, and the spotlight with him for decades. Whether he meant his words literally or as a reflection of old pain, Gene's declaration, "I will never forgive him," echoes like a confession. It speaks to the kind of heartbreak that fame can't fix. Because behind every band that makes history are human beings, fragile, proud, and flawed, who carry their own wounds long after the lights fade. In the end, their story isn't just about fame or money. It's about 2 men who once believed they could conquer the world together, only to be conquered by their own differences. Gene once said that Kiss was more than a band. It was a brand, a philosophy, a monster that could outlive them all. Maybe he was right. But what he didn't say was that the monster they built also devoured the friendship that made it possible. And as the world remembers Ace Frehley, the space ace, the guitarist who made every riff sound like a rocket launch, it's impossible not to think about Gene's words. The man who turned Kiss into an empire still couldn't find it in himself to forgive the friend who gave that empire its soul. In the end, the tragedy of Gene Simmons and Ace Frehley isn't that they fought. It's that they never truly found peace. One built a kingdom, the other chased freedom. And somewhere in between, they lost the brotherhood that had once set the world on fire. Their music will live forever. Their friendship, however, remains frozen in time, unresolved, unhealed, and unforgettable.